Want to welcome you to the 10-Minute University Noontime Chat. The 10-Minute University trademark includes short classes, videos, and handouts on essential gardening information and tips for you, the home gardener. Oregon State University owns the trademark, and the Clackamas County Master Gardeners develop and manage the program. Today's class is the 13th in of a series that started in February. There will be 21 in all. For the complete lineup, please visit the Clackamas Master Gardeners website. You'll find that we've done some wonderful talks in the past few months on soils, understanding soils, pruning trees, mason bees, snails and slugs, and container gardens. These are all available as a recorded version for you now. The series will conclude at the end of May. There'll be 21 in all, and you'll find talks on every Wednesday from April and May. Again, check the website for the schedule. Some of the lists includes ornamental gardens, pests and plant diseases, shade gardening, pollinators, and more. All excellent for your information as a gardener. Our goal as Master Gardeners is to provide you, the home gardener, with best practices as you grow in your garden. Today's chat is the second in a 3-part series to help you grow your own tomatoes. There'll be a Master Gardener, Priscilla Robinson, who will assist with the question and answer portion that will follow this talk, and she'll be dealing with your questions. Be sure to remember to type them in the Q&A box located on your screen. So let's get started. As I mentioned, this is the second of the third on tomatoes. February 24th, I taught how to start tomatoes from seed. And now, as we move forward into today's talk, we're going to check in on those seedlings, see if there's been any problems and strategies for having the best success in growing them and getting them ready for transplanting. Many of you will have not started from seed, and so you're here today to learn about buying a tomato start. And so we'll talk about how to select a tomato start that you might enjoy and want to grow, and then how to take care of that. We'll also talk about very important techniques of potting them up. This will ensure good success if we can do this in a careful and best practice way. And then we will also talk about preparing your garden soil and planting it into the ground. You can see that the series concludes on May 19th, when we'll talk about maintaining them by pruning and watering and fertilizing techniques. Also, we'll talk about diseases that occur and how to minimize, avoid, and manage them. And then we'll end up with hopefully a good harvest, and we'll talk about that. Well, the tomato is a wonderful plant. In fact, 3 out of 4 gardeners, home gardeners, will be growing tomatoes. That's how popular it is. Many will say, if I can't grow anything else, I would like a tomato. It's a wonderful fruit or vegetable. The fruit would be a definition by a botanist. Most of us think of it as a vegetable. So the objectives for today's session is to help you achieve success in growing your own tomato plants. Learn how to choose your tomato varieties, know what to look for in selecting a garden location and the preparation of the site. Know how to care for your seedlings and learn when and how to pot up the seedlings. Well, as I mentioned, in the first session, we started from seed, and the last slide in my first session was this one, where we were talking about it had grown to 2 to 3 inches, and then what do we do? So I said, come back. And so you're back here today, or perhaps you're just going to buy one and it'll look a little like this if you're buying a plant. So this is chapter 2 in growing your own tomatoes. You see the reference there to the first taped video where we talked about starting your seeds. But we're going to start right here. Now, you may not have planted your seeds, so you're going to go out to the stores and buy one. And with the early spring that seems to be coming, I have already seen some in some of the stores. So there's important things for you to look for. There was a question last session about which place what kind of a store is the best place to buy a plant. And that isn't the kind of store, it's the kind of the plant and how well they're being cared for. So you want to look for the following things when you're going to buy a tomato start. You want to make sure it has dark green leaves, that they're not yellowed or wilted. And here's an interesting thing. Think of it as it needs to be as wide as it is tall. Look at these leaves. They have actually formed a bit of a canopy, enough growth that the width is just about as great as the length of the stem. Sometimes in a store, you'll see a very long stem with just a few leaves at the top. You want to avoid that plant. You might find a nice looking tomato that has flowers and maybe even a small tomato on it. No, you don't want that. Or if you do buy that, be sure when you take it home, you pull off the blossoms and the fruit, painful as that is. The reason is you are going to be establishing a root system in that plant as you start to pot it up. And if it is putting its energies into developing fruits, flowers and fruits, it won't have the energy to work on developing the root system. So for now, if that has any flowers or fruits, take it off and let's get busy getting a good root system established first. You also want to make sure that it's not been sitting on the shelf long enough that it's gotten pot bound. That means that the roots have grown around so far that they've hit the edge of the container and are circling around. If you're comfortable with it, you can look to see by pulling it up just a little bit, or at least looking at the bottom of the pot. And if there are roots protruding outside the bottom of the pot, you know it's pot bound. You want to avoid buying one of those. So that will help you as you start searching for what does a healthy plant look like. Now let's talk about what kind you want to buy. So in selecting a variety, you want to consider how you want to use it. That's what's really important. So at the end of the season, you don't have what you wanted. One of the very favorite kinds for a lot of gardeners is the cherry tomato, the Patio or Pixie. This is a small tomato. It can be just picked and eaten right off the bush, so we enjoy it. I've listed several kinds of them. The Sun Gold has been voted most popular year after year, and it looks like this. It's a wonderful sweet tomato. The next two are varieties that have been developed by Oregon State, and they are also, I have grown them, and they're also excellent. Matt's Wild Cherry is a small one, as well as Sweet Million, but very, very good and very prolific. You'll notice days to maturity, 50 to 60. So this is an early ripening tomato. The smaller the tomato, usually the earlier it ripens. I do need to explain that days to maturity means not from the day you planted the seed or the day that you bought it in the store, but rather the day that it went into the ground in your garden. That's the day the clock starts running. So if you think about it, if you planted your seeds in March and you're not putting it in until middle of May, that plant could already be 50 days old, but the clock starts with day one, measuring when it will mature. Look at the varied colors of the tomatoes. They're just wonderful. Though it's interesting, that's a genetic determinant what color it will be. Every tomato is green at start. And then as it ripens, then the chlorophyll that caused it to be green will convert into pigments that will provide different colors. And I have grown purple and red and yellow and orange. That's one of the fun things about growing tomatoes is the varieties. So the first kind you might want to think about is a cherry tomato. You can grow it in a smaller pot, so it could sit on your patio if you don't have room in your garden. Perhaps you like to have a product that you can process. You like to do salsa or tomato paste or sauce. Then you'll want to use a paste tomato. And the first two listed here, again, are ones that Oregon State has developed. Excellent tomatoes for a paste. I have grown Amish paste, Roma, and San Marzano. Amish paste is about a mid-season ripening. San Marzano's later. But the nice thing about a paste is that it's a very dense, meaty, and makes a wonderful canning product. Perhaps you just want to have one on your hamburger or your salad or your sandwich. These are medium-sized, the slicers. They take a little bit longer than the others to develop and ripen. The first, let's see, the first four are from Oregon State Development. I think one of the earliest ones they did was the Legend, which was developed in order to combat blight. And so these new ones that are being developed are excellent to try. I've grown a lot of Carmelo, and that's a wonderful slicer as well. Then if you want to have one that just fills your hands, both of them, then try a beefsteak. This is a marvelous tomato. Recognize that with it being such a large tomato, the days of maturity sometimes are way beyond 2.5 months. So that you've got time to wait for it. But it is a wonderful tomato to grow. It will require a lot of aggressive staking because it's and caging because it's a heavy tomato on a big plant. This particular tomato is being held by my grandson. It's called a Big Zack. Pretty impressive little tomato. So in addition to deciding what you want to use it for, you need to consider some of these terms and decide if that impacts your decision as well. An heirloom tomato is an open pollinated, handed down for generations. They're kind of sometimes the lumpy, funny ones because they aren't grown for their shapes or perfection, but they are, I think, a very flavorful tomato. They sometimes can be a little more fragile in growing or a little more vulnerable, but you can save the seeds and you can grow them for hundreds of years and you will still get the same tomato. You might end up buying a hybrid. Hybrid is cross-pollinated with two parents that have really good qualities. They bring them together and hopefully end up with a tomato that has more disease resistant, maybe a higher yield. You'll not be able to save the seeds and get the same product because they'll only mimic or reproduce what one parent had. Some people think a hybrid sacrifices flavor. You'll have to see as you try them. You can identify that when you're buying it by the term F1, which means the first generation. Then there's the grafted tomato, which you may see on the shelves. The grafted tomato was developed to try to produce more tomatoes per plant. We've often seen and known that grafting occurred with fruit trees for years, hundreds of years, but the grafting of annual vegetables is quite new. And it does improve the production as well as the disease resistant. And that's because you take maybe this favorite heirloom that you have that's a little bit vulnerable and you put it on top of a vigorous rootstock by grafting it right onto the stem. And that rootstock will drive the production of that plant. It was originally a weed or a volunteer type of wild tomato that's very vigorous, and it will be an impressive tomato. You will not be able to save the seeds to get a grafted tomato. What you'll get is the original scion, whatever you had grafted on. Well, you also need to consider the room that you have to grow them and how you want them to grow, the growth pattern. Should you have a determinate? That's a term that is used versus indeterminate. Let's talk just a little bit about that. A determinate tomato is more of a bush. It's shorter. It flowers and fruits on the end of each of the vines. So you end up with a crop that's done within a short period of time, usually 1 to 2 weeks, 3 weeks. You'll have almost all the tomatoes ripe, which makes it really good if you want everything ready for you to can. It's a smaller size tomato. As I say, it's a bush, so you can grow it in a pot. You may want to stake it just to protect it a little bit if it gets a little too bushy, but generally you can get by without staking it. So that's a determinate plant. An indeterminate is more of a vine, and it will grow very large and tall. You can harvest it over a longer period of time, often 2 to 3 months. It will definitely need to be staked. And your overall yield will be greater than the determinate. Now, if we look at the determinate here, you can see a lot of tomatoes, and they're all ripe, ready to be picked and enjoyed and processed. The indeterminate, however, has only a couple ripe. There's a couple waiting to be ripened, very small ones, and even some blossoms yet to develop. So you can see this is a long-term production here of tomatoes. So you need to decide what your needs are. The determinate can be grown generally in less space than the indeterminate. Well, those of you who have started with me in February planting seeds, let's talk about maybe how they're doing. Hopefully yours don't look like this. I had 1 year when this happened, and so I thought it important to mention so that you can avoid it if you haven't developed it yet, and if you have, recognize it, and we'll talk about the solution. This is damping off, and it actually has been mentioned in a couple of the previous webinars from some of the other instructors about what they were planting for seeds, but it's a fungal disease that attacks the stems of the seedlings that are right at the soil line. I'm going to show you here. You see this is only a thread left from the soil up until the stem. They're just collapsing, and it cuts off any of the nutrients or water getting up to the plant, and so the plant dies. It's a pretty heartbreaking thing to see because it seemed like it happened all at once when I saw it. Well, the causes have been defined that seedling mix, that could be that it wasn't sterile, or maybe we used containers that weren't cleaned properly, or possibly just overwatering. Unfortunately, because it's a fungal disease, there's nothing you can do at this point, and you're best to just dispose of everything, the seedlings and the growing mix as well, and be sure to use good hygiene, and if you're going to reuse the containers, to clean them well. So that's one of the challenges, and hopefully none of you are going to see that. Now, this is a real common issue, and it can be remedied. It's just turning the early seedlings get a little bit leggy as they grow indoors, because they are doing the following. They are searching for light. They get spindly and tilting because they do have insufficient light. There you saw in that picture how they were tilting, trying to find it. Perhaps there wasn't enough soil moisture, and they're just stretching. They're stretching both because of the lack of water. Maybe you forgot to water, or the soil mix is poor quality. Or perhaps the temperatures were high, and that causes a rapid unbalanced growth. Stems end up growing faster than the leaves. Think about this. If you've got your plants, your little seedlings, on a heat map that's on 24 hours, but you've got them using natural light, then they only have light at this time of year, probably 9 or 10 hours. So the heat is driving the growth of the plant where it does not have enough light to match that push from the heat. So consider that, those three items that may be causing your plants to get leggy. Sometimes if you have your tomato plants sitting in pots, waiting to go out in the garden, you can see that you develop a little bit of nutritional deficiencies, especially as the plant gets kind of large or waiting to get good into the garden. The plant gets stressed. Now, I had an example of this a couple of years ago when I started real early and planting them. And by the time it was a cold spring, and so they were in large pots waiting to go out. And the soil, I did not care enough for the nutritional supplements, and this plant developed a magnesium deficiency. The leaves became brittle and yellow. You can see that the veins are green, but the surface of the leaf is yellowed. Well, I did a little research and found out if I used a foliar spray of magnesium sulfate, it helped, and certainly it did. And they turned around and we were fine when I put them in the garden. So the caution here is don't start your seedling too early, because if you had an early spring and warm spring, you could put them out. But if not, then they're going to sit in a pot for a longer time. And that could be a risk that you end up with nutritional deficiencies. There are other symptoms and other causes of the elements that could be missing. So if you end up with a leaf that you're not sure from your plant while it's still indoors and you can't tell what it is, you can always do a little research. Take a picture of the late leaf and send it to the master gardeners, and they can help you diagnose it. Well, the other common problem that you're going to get is that you're going to have, if you don't transplant or repot, you're going to get root-bound plants. That's a good demonstration here. You can see these roots, they should be nice and white, and they've turned brown. So this plant probably even had roots extending down through the pot. So it's time that this plant gets moved. Well, I've shown you some of the things, confessed some of the problems I've had as I have been managing my work with tomatoes. And here is a good way for you to remember this, because mistakes happen sometimes. Mistakes are tools for learning. Evaluate your trials. Making mistakes is a sign you're trying to do things better. There's usually little penalty for mistakes if you learn from them. Good to remember because all of us find challenges in gardening, and that's half the fun of it, is trying to figure it out and get better at it. Okay, well, we're back to where I showed that first picture. We talked about the seedlings. You know what you're going to buy now when you go to the store. It's time to get it, transfer it. Okay, we're going to use the term potting up, and that means we're still keeping it indoors. It's not being sent out into the garden. It's not being transplanted. So potting up means that we are starting with our seedling, maybe 2 to 3 inches tall. It's about 4 weeks after we did the seed sowing. We're going to move it to about the size of a 4-inch pot to avoid getting it pot bound. Now, after that, if it gets to be about 6 inches tall, you're going to want to move it to a larger pot. After repotting, it's important to keep the plants out of direct sunlight for at least a day or so to allow the roots to recover, because transplanting can cause a shock to a plant. You're pulling it out of the container it was in. There may be some soil that falls away from the roots, so you try not to have that happen. But just transplanting it can be a little bit of a shock, and if it's in direct sun, that can tax it and stress it too much. So the question is, when to transplant? Well, obviously when it gets root bound or when it gets to a certain height. But if you also notice these qualities, leggy, spindly stems, yellow leaves, or if you water it and it wilts just shortly after watering, then you know it's time to repot. So when you're thinking of potting up, you're going to use a dilute fertilizer to soak the seedlings prior to transfer. You remember I mentioned that moving it out of that pot is a shock. And if the soil falls away from the roots, that can dry them very quickly. So you want that soil to stay tight to the roots. So soak it good before you transfer it. Take off the lower leaves, and we'll talk more about that. Use a clean potting mix. And when you go to buy your potting mix, look at the label. Look to see what it includes. If it's loaded with a lot of fertilizer, you may find, especially nitrogen, you may find it's going to really feed your plant, and you'll have to be careful what you then add. So check out your potting mix to see what's in it. You're going to want to plant your tomato deeper in the pot, and then after that, you're going to water and fertilize, and we'll talk about the fertilizer techniques, and then put it in a protected spot or provide protection. Okay, so here we go. We're removing the lower leaves. You can see that can be done with just a pinch or a little cutter, scissors, right close to the stem, because that is going to develop, all this is going to develop into roots now. So we take off these lower leaves, and I'll show you where we're going to put it in the pot. You can see it's down a ways. Here's a scheme that's a little easier to see how much lower. Here's where it was, the top of the pot, and now it's down much lower. I've taken off most of the leaves so that they're just barely above the surface, filled it up with good soil potting mix here, and that plant now is going to develop new roots. You'll see the term adventitious roots. That is a quality that many of the garden plants can have, and flowers, where you take advantage of that, tomatoes especially, because when you do, this is what happens. We can have increased root development. Every time you repot or transplant, it's going to have more roots coming out. It's a quality of the tissues of the stem to send out, when they come in contact with the soil, they send out more roots. You remember I talked about grafted plants. It was the root ball, it was the root stock that drove that plant to make it so successful. This isn't a grafted plant, but I can try to mimic in many ways that quality of lots of strong roots by planting deep, and have a much healthier plant by doing so. Adventitious roots. Think about that as you're repotting. Well, let's talk a bit about watering. The seedlings need water. They dry out quickly when they're in just a little bit of soil, but I would caution you to avoid getting a sprayer and spraying overhead. We know that water washing off the leaves, washing under the soil, just transfers any fungal disease that might be developing, or helps to create them if the leaves stay wet. I would recommend that you do what we call a bottom soak. And this is really easy and it takes less time. Get a nice container where you can put about an inch or two of water. And about every third time that I water or put my plants in it, I add and make a dilute fertilizer solution, about 25% of what normally would be. And I put my pots down in it. They will soak up the water from the bottom, which is feeding what? The roots, not the leaves, but the roots. I leave it in there until I find that it might, depending on the size of the pot, of the container, might take an hour or two. It might take a better part of the day, depending how it is and how well that moisture will be taken up into the soil. Very good way to water your plants and actually takes less time, as you can just put all of them in there together and water them. Bottom soaking. Well, your seedlings are growing well now. You're getting so that you're thinking about where am I going to put them in the garden. Let's talk a little bit about, you've got to plan ahead for your location. 8 hours of sun minimum is necessary to grow tomatoes. Look around your place in your garden and decide where you can have that. You want to have a loamy, well-drained soil. There's an excellent Master Gardener webinar, one of the first given earlier this spring by Sherry Shang, and it's on all about soils. And you can learn a great deal about what makes a loamy, well-drained soil. So I'd advise you to check that out. You also want to protect your plants from the wind. You don't want it where the wind's going to be constantly blowing. Air circulation is important, but not a windstorm. And just conversely, you want to avoid low spots where there won't be any circulation, and there in fact may be a risk of moisture that just puddles and doesn't drain away. So avoid low spots. Get your soil ready. You'll see the use here of the fork. You're going to get out there and kind of play around in the soil and see if it's workable. If it is, then start clearing weeds. Turn the soil to about 10 to 12 inches in depth. Turn it over and add some organic matter. Work it in. If you have a chance, check the pH. You want just a little bit lower or basically neutral pH. Now, in the past, we master gardeners in Clackamas County have been so pleased and eager to test your soil, and we hope to be able to do that again soon once we get back to having in-person services. But in the meantime, you may want to get a kit from the store or contact a lab. But it's very important that you have the proper pH. All the work you're going to do on your tomato, if the pH is wrong, it won't do well. It won't be able to grow, pull up the nutrients that are in the soil that it needs. So check the pH. Now the soil, this is a good picture here of soil that's not ready for planting. It's too wet. It makes a ball and it's not falling apart. It's wet. Here, the temperature of the soil consistency is much looser. Make a ball, but then it'll open your hand and it'll fall apart. So that's a good sign that your soil is ready for you to start. The temperature is now 60 degrees or warmer. That's the soil temperature, not the air temperature. The soil temperature needs to be 60 degrees or warmer. The tomato is a semi-tropical plant, and it does not like to go into cold soil. Okay, potting up. We're going to continue to do that. When it gets to be 6 to 10 inches tall, you might be able to put it in the ground with some protection, especially if the soil temperature is reaching 60 degrees. However, if it's still kind of cool, the weather doesn't permit, then you need to keep potting it up because that 6 to 10 inch plant in a small pot is not going to do well. It needs to get into a larger container with more potting medium. But you're going to do that. I would say that I repot probably 3 times before I have my plant go in the garden, because each time I do it, I can put it lower and get more roots developing. But before I think about putting it out in the garden, I need to consider hardening off. I want to harden off my plants, maybe almost a week before I put them, 4 to 5 days before we're going to transplant them into the garden. Or if I'm going to repot them and put them out, yeah, I can do that as well. It's important to expose it to the sunlight, but I would use at first filtered sun, not direct sun. Again, we don't want to shock the plants. Start slowly, 1 hour at first. and then gradually increase it to about 8 hours. So what you're trying to do is help this plant go from a very comfortable, warm place and get used to the fact that it's going to be out in the elements, and it's time for it to try to get toughened up a little bit. And this is a gentle, nice way to do it. Now, you're anxious to put it in the soil, get it out in the garden. Your soil isn't warming up. A good way to do it and increase the season of your growing is to use a plastic mulch to pre-warm the soil. Now you can use a clear plastic. It probably will warm the soil the fastest, but it also allows the light to go through, and then you'll have weeds growing in it. You can use black or red plastic. That warms as well, and it will block the weeds. We've used black plastic for years, and we put it on a couple of weeks before we think we want to put the plants out, and I can see a temperature increase of 10 to 15 degrees from when that went on to when I'm ready to put my plants in. So it's very effective. There are some stories and anecdotal information that red sometimes can increase the yield and ripen the fruit faster. And you can find that to purchase as well. So we're getting ready to plant it into the garden. Our soil is 60 degrees. The plant's been hardened off, and we're ready to put it out. We need to get some stakes so we can plant it and keep it upright. As we think about transplanting into the garden, again, a review, soil is 60 degrees, the plant's hardened off, but now we need to say, well, how are we going to put it in the ground? What's known as trench or vertical, we'll talk about that. Before we put it in the garden, though, let's again remember we need to hydrate the plant first. And we're going to locate the holes that we're going to dig and plant them in for at least 4 feet apart in order to have those tomatoes, when they start growing, have room to grow and not crowd each other and have good circulation. The trench versus the vertical planting method, and you'll have to decide which you like the best. Each have their advantages and disadvantages. Trench planting you can do early in the season because the soil will be warmer closer to the surface, so that you can plant it in a shallower place, and that warmer soil will speed the plant growth. However, consider later in the summer, those roots are much more close to the surface than vertical planting. So you're going to have roots that will be prone to dry out faster. So you may have to water more if you're using a trench planting. Here's an example, a picture of it. You can see that we've removed how many leaves? This is a lot of stem now. Digging a trench about 12 inches deep, removing the leaves and laying the plant on the side. This is going to be at about a 30-degree angle, and then cover it up with the soil that you've enhanced and amended in your garden. That's the trench planting. Then the vertical, if you were to plant it in the early season, you'd find that it would have to be down lower, deeper in the soil, which means the soil is cooler around the roots. So it won't take off as fast. The initial growth will be slower. But you'll have the advantage in the summer when it's hot that the roots will be deeper and they'll have more access to water to draw on, and possibly you don't have to have the pressure of watering as much as you do the trench planted tomato. There's an example. It's going in a vertical planting, digging a hole about 12 inches deep, planting to that depth. So you know that if it came out of a pot, it wasn't a 12-inch deep pot. So you're planting it deeper again to develop more roots. And you're removing the leaves up a ways so that you're not having them fall down into the soil. But don't remove too many. Actually, sometimes if you plant deep enough, you can remove those two very shortly, and then you have those to be generating, and then you keeping the leaves out of the soil. When these leaves drape down in the soil, it's just an avenue for insects, pests, and disease to travel up and get into the plant. Well, the plant needs to be, we're pinching off some of the lower leaves, and it needs to be staked. So we're trying to promote good growth in the garden. Right after it's planted, not a week later, but right after it's planted, put a cage in for support. The reason you don't want to wait is that you may come back, try to put them in, and sinking the cage metal tips may cut into the roots that have already spread out. So put it in, and it needs to be a large and sturdy cage. You can see these are pretty thick metal pieces that will hold that. Sometimes we've thought we've had a good sturdy cage, and when the plant grows way over the top of it, then it crashes, and there we are with a broken tomato plant or falling over. So choose your support with care, because that plant that you're putting in can eat 8 to 10 feet sometimes. This is the type that we finally come to after all the ones that have broken down or failed us. This is a PVC inch pipe that we purchased just at a hardware store. And my husband has cut them to 2.5-inch lengths, and we build this. And you can see there's joints and connectors. The nice thing is we can make it as tall as we want. If I had a determinate, I wanted a cage, I would only have to probably make it go this high. If I've got a nice tall one or a grafted plant, it can go higher. You can see there's a central stem, a central brace here. So that allows me to tie the tomato to it and brace it there, as well as the PVC borders that support the plant. It can be pushed deep into the soil, and it is extremely sturdy. So that's a nice one that you can perhaps build on your own, or have someone who might be able to have access to some PVC and a saw. The nice thing about it is we take it apart at the end of the year, and it's all just in little pieces of 2.5 feet, and it goes in a bag, and it's much easier to store than the metal commercial ones. Sometimes it's important that we consider rotating our crop, and that can be hard if you don't have a large garden space. So you can think about buying a cloth pot, and they make them big enough. You can put in a tomato plant with a large cage and grow it very successfully. At the end of the year, you empty it out, and it can be reused again next year. So the plant will come out and just grow right to the edge and do what we call air pruning, and so it will just continue to grow and not get root bound even in this. Again, it's a good solution if you want to rotate your plants but don't have the sunny space to do a tomato. You might be able to use something like this. Well, we're putting our plants out in the garden, and now it's time to think about protecting them. Can't always guarantee that the temperature is going to stay warm. So if it looks like it's going to fall below 55 degrees, you're going to want to put some added protection. This is just a picture of one. You can make some cloches, hot caps, plastic hoop tunnels, or frames wrapped in plastic, anything that will keep the air warm around you're trying to maintain the temperature around that plant so it doesn't drop so much at night. We have a master gardener who does a wonderful job of covering her tomato plants and actually building a little space for them to grow. It's almost like a little greenhouse, and she can put her plants out in. You know, she spaced them here about 5 feet apart. And then she has cut holes so that she can have good air circulation and reach in if she needs to agitate the blossoms to help with self-pollination. Here's the prime spot for a tomato plant. This one's probably got to be very happy. It's in red plastic, so the soil's been warmed nicely. It's got a jug of water that absorbs the heat during the day and then holds it so the plant stays nice and warm. And then it's in a nice enclosure to keep the wind and the frost away. So that's going to be a happy plant. Fertilizing. Tomatoes are very heavy feeders. Oregon State University recommends using a fertilizer that has a ratio of 1 to 2 to 1. And I think you're learning from your other webinars about fertilizer. The first one is nitrogen, which is for growing foliage. The second one, number 2, is for phosphorus for growing, and that's what you want for producing flowers and fruit. And the third, potassium K, feeds the roots and tubers. Well, if you're growing tomatoes, you don't want all the just green and foliage. You want flowers and fruit. So you want a ratio in your fertilizer of 1 to 1. If you're tempted to use nitrogen or end up with a fertilizer or a potting soil that has a high rate of nitrogen, you're going to end up with a lot of foliage. and that sometimes can contribute to the development of blossom end rot. So again, watch your ratio in your fertilizer, 1:1. Well, let's talk about watering because that's very important. Remember, we want to water the roots and not the leaves. Consistent, schedule, and deep. For the seedlings, bottom watering gets the roots hydrated the best. We showed that picture of how to do that. After you plant it in the garden, the watering should be about an inch a week in normal weather. That amounts to about 3 gallons for a plant because the plants are usually on a 5-foot square pattern. If it gets hot, you may have to increase it to 2 inches of water, which would be about 6 gallons. And now, if you've got a sandy loam soil that's going to drain excessively fast, then you're going to have to water more often, maybe every 4 to 5 days. If it's a heavier clay, you might do it only 7 to 10 days. You want to water early in the day, and trench or drip methods are superior to overhead. When you water overhead, the leaves get wet and it's prone to fungal diseases, and you want to avoid that. So to summarize, we have talked about the types and varieties of tomatoes that you can select. Again, determine what you want for your garden. How are you going to use them? You're going to dry them or can them or slice them or impress people with a nice beefsteak on a hamburger. Look also for the days of harvest. It's nice if you can plant a variety so that you can start harvesting tomatoes in 50 days and still have them at 90 to 100 days. Then you've got them for a nice long period, balancing the cherries with the beefsteaks. We've talked about preparing your garden, soil, and the bed, about transplanting and potting up, when to do it, how and why, and also the care of the plant in support as you plant it in, watering and fertilizing it. Remember, if nothing else, remember this: transplant deep and the roots can develop a strong and healthy system. So tips for success. Let's kind of a nice review here. We're going to pot up. You're going to use sterile potting soil, avoid a root-bound plant, and consider bottom watering your seedlings. And always think about transplanting or potting up to a larger pot if the seedling appears leggy or wilts readily. So potting up maybe 2 or 3 times before you're ready to put that in the garden. Then, if it's ready to go in the garden, the soil is 60 degrees, your garden soil's been prepared. You are going to use your soil warming techniques. Consider using structures to protect the plants from the cold, and we've shown some examples of those. Be sure you support it with stakes and cages. Put them in at the time that you put that plant in, because if you wait, your stakes and cages, as you drive them down in, may actually disrupt the roots. So put it in when you're, even though it seems like it's the plant's awful small for that big cage, it'll grow, and it's best to put it in before the roots get to that point where you're going to disrupt them. So here's some considerations. When? Well, if we were going to plant the seeds, you would have done that at around the spring equinox. You could still do it. We're not that far past, but you're going to start seeing plants on the market. So if you don't want to do seeds, you can wait and very shortly by buying plants in the nurseries. Be sure that you pot up when it gets root bound. Purchase, if you're going to buy a start, get them early for a good selection, but you'll need to continue to repot it. That's the best way to treat it. You might even grow into a 1 gallon or larger pot before you're ready to put it out in the garden. And you're ready to put it in the garden when the soil is 60 degrees and the ambient temperatures stay consistently above 55 degrees. So for us here, where I live in the Willamette Valley, that's about middle of May. Any sooner than that, and I do risk some damage, and the soil may not be warm enough if I haven't warmed it. Why? Seedlings repotted can be placed lower each time to grow more roots. We talked about that. Every time you put it in, putting it lower. Transplanting early into a garden or bed will require adding protective measures, and that's more work and supplies, but you can do it. Consider the amount of plants, the time and the money spent, and the effort when you're growing tomatoes. I don't put my tomatoes in too early, so I don't have to put a whole lot of work into all of the things that were shown, all the little covers for the cages. But it is fun if you want to have an early tomato, because the master gardener that I showed with all those systems for covering, I'm sure has some good bragging rights, because she does have ripe tomatoes soon. Well, the final webinar on tomatoes will be May 19th, and we're going to talk about best cultural practices, such as watering, fertilizing, and pruning, which are very important as your plant starts to grow. We're going to also talk about managing diseases, blossom end rot, and blight, was we want to have you be as successful as possible with your tomato. You'll be able to register through mastergardeners.org for registering for the final webinar, and that will come out again May 19th. Some of the resources, the Oregon State University has extension publications. Those are all excellent. This one right here, Grow Your Own Tomatoes, from Dr. Neil Bell, I used extensively in my presentation. It's excellent. Also, the Master Gardener has a helpline, which you can access for a resource. And you can also go back to the 10-minute university videos and handouts, and you'll see some of the following ones: growing tomatoes and gardening with compost. So again, themastergardener.org. So those are the resources you can access. So thank you for watching, and happy gardening. I think we're going to move now to seeing if there's some questions that people have. So I have a master gardener who's going to help me, Priscilla Robinson, who's excellent, and she's going to follow up with any questions that have come in. And there she is.
Hey there.
Hi, Priscilla. What do we got for some questions?
Well, we have had some really good questions, and we obviously have experienced gardeners and beginner gardeners. So I'd like to address all of the types of questions that we've gotten in. In terms of the beginner gardener, is there a particular type of tomato? We're talking heirloom, hybrid, grafted. Is one of those going to be best for a beginner gardener?
Well, the heirlooms can be a little trickier to grow. They're a little more fragile. A hybrid is basically bred to be more disease resistant. And so you might want to start with a hybrid, and you'll be able to see that on the tag, or you would be starting seeds at this point. So I'd look on the tag, that it'll tell you it's a hybrid. The grafted is a fun tomato to grow, but you better be prepared for a good large spot and a lot of staking, because they can grow to be 12 feet tall and produce 100 pounds of tomatoes. So you might not want to step into that as a beginner, but I would say start with some good hybrids. And you can just probably Google that and see what is recommended, or go to your store and ask around. Again, remember that you're looking for this sign that says F1, which means it is a hybrid, and that may have it on the tags.
Okay, great. And that gardener also wants to know, is there a particular time of day you should be taking the temperature of the soil? Can you just go into a little bit of detail what that entails?
Well, the soil temperature doesn't change as much as the air temperature does. So I've not seen that much difference between morning and evening. It depends if it's wet or if we've had a frost, but probably right now, if you went out and measured the temperature of your soil, it would be a pretty much constant, whether it was 10 o'clock in the morning or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. You're going to go down further because you're planting this in deep. You're not going to measure the first inch or so of the temperature. So does that help? What are your thoughts on that, Priscilla?
No, I think that's great. No, I think that's great. A gardener wants to know, there are some seedlings and the leaves are starting to curl downward. Is that a disease? Possibly. What should they do? They're worried about hurting the other plants too.
There are actually some tomatoes that's what their leaves do. I've grown those, and it can be a little frightening at first if you're not prepared for that, but they curl down. So maybe do a little research on that type that you planted to see if that's it.
Okay.
So leaf curling can be a sign though of some problems, not getting enough water for one thing. It's curling under to try and protect itself and keep the moisture in the leaf. Check to see if it curls at different times of the day, if it curls in different amounts. If it curls at the end of the day, you could probably say that's avoiding transpiration, trying to keep the water in. If it's always curled, that's the style of the plant.
And whenever I see a leaf curled, I always take a peek underneath those leaves just to make sure there aren't any pests that might be in there. But I think that's a really comprehensive answer. Thanks. Two questions on greenhouses. One is it too late to start tomato plants in my greenhouse?
Good question. Actually, we just passed 11 days ago the spring equinox, which is often a good time to plant tomato seeds. So you're only 11 days late, and I think it'll be just fine because you won't want to set your tomatoes out much before the middle of May to avoid any of the frost, and your soil will be warm enough. So that'll still give you 6 weeks of growth. So by all means, if you want to start, the nice thing about starting from seed is you have a much greater variety available. When you go to a nursery to buy your plant, you got to buy what they chose, and they're always picking nice varieties. But there's a 700 to 1,000 varieties of tomatoes, and if you got online and said, "I want to study what I want, what I'm looking for," you might be able to buy a seed that you could not find a plant for. Get busy and plant it, and have fun.
Awesome. Oops. All right, another greenhouse question is when we're repotting, what type of protection, this is out in the greenhouse, what kind of protection do we need to provide for those plants that are being repotted? Do we have to give them some extra shade during this transition?
I don't. One thing I do is I have a fan. I mean, I've got circulation all going so that you don't have risks of fungus and things. So there's a nice fan that's going. I have a temperature, so I'm not exceeding 85 degrees, and I open it up and let it's not get too hot. I have heat mats so that they're being hopefully kept at roughly the same temperature the soil temperature is. Um, if it starts to get hot, I put a shade cloth over my greenhouse. It's small enough that I can do that. So you don't want the temperature to get too hot. Does that answer the question,
I
Priscilla?
think it does. I think it's great. And there was just a question on crop rotation. How many times can you plant tomatoes in the same spot? And if they have to be there, is there anything that I can do to try and help my soil so I'm not going to be promoting disease?
Very good question. And it is a challenge because we recommend rotating. And yet, if you say, well, it needs to be sunny for 8 hours a day, and people are going to say, I don't have that much space. So one of the things you can do is buy a grafted tomato because it can survive in year after year in the same place because it's far more disease resistant. You can actually remove some of the soil, say go dig down about 5 or 6 inches and replace it with some different soil that will allow that to be able to grow in there safely. And just, I suppose, practice good nutrition and hygiene in the plant. So maybe you have to add some extra supplements, have your soil tested. They're big drawers of calcium, and so you may have to do extra calcium year after year in the same spot. And we do know that rotation is an ideal that not all of us can achieve, but even 1 year break helps. And you want to avoid, when you're rotating, don't plant the same family there because they all kind of share the same problems. So don't put peppers and potatoes and those in there in the same, because they all kind of come off the same bug problem. So anyway, I hope that helps. But another solution is to get one of those cloth pots.
Speaking of those cloth pots, that was quite a few questions came up.
Oh,
How big was that cloth pot, and a suggestion for purchasing?
We got those a long time ago, and I think that is, it probably goes by gallon size, but it looks like it's about 5 feet across, because we had or maybe 4 feet across, because the we had the cage that was built out of the piping, and that was 2.5 feet across. So it's probably a 4 foot diameter, but you can get them in all different sizes. Yeah, they're available not for just tomatoes. They're available they're a nice way to garden if you don't have the space.
Yeah, I grow potatoes in bags, and I'm telling you, that's the easiest harvest you're ever going to have. Just dump it out.
Yep.
All right. Talking about putting the plants in the ground, what do you like to put a handful in? Someone said, is it helpful to put a handful of lime at planting time in the hole? What else would you suggest putting in the hole when you're planting it?
Lime's always good. But you should have your soil tested before you start adding a lot of stuff. Um, we teach best practices based on research, but I will tell you, tomatoes have been grown for hundreds of years, and gardening has been happening a long time. And there's a lot of good advice that is anecdotal. There's even some good folklore out there that's good. We don't get into that, but when you get a chance to study up on tomatoes and see, my father used to put a tablespoon of Epsom salts in, which is magnesium sulfate. And that was what was missing in that plant I showed you that had the yellow foliage. So but the thing of it is, you don't want to just start putting things into the soil until you know what your soil's like. Add what's needed, but don't add what's not needed. So have your soil tested to make sure that your soil is needing what you're adding. But you can also just put in some good organic matter. That's a really good way to start. But you'll want to mix that in ahead of time a little bit and put the organic matter in.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Um, how often do you bottom soak the seedlings?
Well, mine are in the greenhouse now, and it's going to be a warm day today. I will probably bottom soak them every day or every other day, because I still have them in 72 cell plants, trays, and so they dry out fast. It depends the size of the pot that plant is growing. So feel it. If it's starting to get a little dry, if it's a 4-inch pot, you could probably go a couple of days, maybe even 3 or 4 days. But if it's a 72 cell tray, you might be doing it every day or every other day, especially as it gets warm. That's where you just need the finger test.
Yeah. And for indeterminate plants, tomato plants, they just keep growing and growing. Is that something that you could prune along the way? And after planting, when should you start that process?
Oh, that's a wonderful question to segue into our next session in May.
Okay, well then let's wait for that one.
Well, but the point is, yes, you do need to prune. You need to prune a lot for a tomato, or you're going to just have a bush, a tree, and you won't be able to find the tomatoes. You'll increase your crop by pruning. So tune in May 19th for that.
And someone wanted to buy some of the OSU variety tomato seeds, because they're really going to get them in the ground soon. What's the best source for finding, and how do you know it is an OSU variety?
Well, yes. Okay. Good question. First of all, go online and Google OSU developed tomato varieties, development of tomato varieties. There's maybe 8 or 10, and you can see that list. Then you take the list to your favorite nursery store. They will probably have many of them, if not all. And if they don't, you can ask them, say, how come you're not carrying these? Because they are they're grown for our area, the Willamette Valley. And so, did that answer the question, you think?
I think it did. I think that's a really good place to start. And then they can always contact us at Seamaster Gardeners, at metromastergardeners.org and get some information there. Okay, we're going to be wrapping up pretty soon. The questions have really flooded in now here at the end. And since you talked about soil testing, is that another Google for the area? Does it need to be an agriculture company that's going to test it? Or, how do you start to look for someone to test your soil?
Yeah, I would Google soil testing for gardens. So there's several things you can look for. Now, the master gardeners just did the pH, but that's a real basic and very important thing to determine. But beyond that, if you want, you'll need to go to a lab that does that. And I think they'll probably be listed under soil tests. And they'll check for nitrogen and boron and all kinds of things that are in your soil to see, if you have to do some additives. It's important not to just pour stuff into the soil because the bag says so. You want to determine what your soil needs. You're feeding your soil when you feed it, not feeding plants, you're feeding your soil. And
Right.
that's important.
All right.
Priscilla, it's important for us to remind people that if we didn't get to their questions, they can Google or send them to, is that links? Down there at the bottom, looking to see what our helper Sean has put in there. I think it's Master Gardeners at here at 2017.org.
Okay.
And if not, they can always call the Metro hotline. And I think there are links to that. Sean's been sending out probably. If not, I can't go back. I've closed off the slides. There's a lot of resources that Oregon State and Master Gardeners provide for you. We're here to help you be successful in growing your tomatoes. It's a wonderful plant. 75% of the gardeners want to succeed, and we want to help you succeed.
And I really can relate to this person because they want to know, is there a sketch to the PVC tomato cage? A couple of questions came in. They like the design. And are there some guidelines that maybe will be posted, or could you bring that up at your next?
Well, it'll be a little late. Yeah, it'll be a little late. I'll have to ask my husband because he designed it. But basically, it's inch long PVC pipe that's just cut 2.5 feet sections so that you make a box, and you can buy the joints and the corners that connect it. And it's kind of like Lincoln Logs, or what is that game? Anyway, where you put stuff together and keep building. So the plan is kind of like what you got room for, what you think your tomatoes can grow into. As I say, the determinants, we've only used the smaller part. If it's a grafted or a large one, we make it go up 8 feet because the tomato is going to go there. So anyway.
Hot off the press, Sherry, one of our associate producers, has said that soil testing can be acquired it's called Oregon Labs for Soil Testing. And there is a link in our chat box. So those people with lots of questions on soil testing, I think that's where you're going to want to start your search. And I just want to remind people that this presentation is being recorded. So therefore, it's going to be available in a few days. So those of you who want to build that wonderful Lincoln Log PVC tomato cage, you'll be able to watch this broadcast again and maybe just pause it on that one particular picture and come up with some ideas, or print it out, take it to a big box store. Maybe they can help you out.
Well, and I can get my husband to drop some directions, and we'll put it on the website too. How to build a PVC cage. I'm sure
Tinker Toys. Someone says we're talking about Tinker Toys. Yeah. All right.
Many years ago.
Well, you know what? We have gone over our 1 o'clock sort of cap, but we appreciate everyone for hanging on. And if we didn't get your question answered live, we will try and get to those so that you can get the answers in the future. And I know that tomatoes are my favorite vegetable that I like to have, or is it a fruit? Out in my garden, it's the most gratifying to plant, and I am going to use some of these tips that you have given us today.
Well, thank you. We love growing tomatoes, and I'm hoping that all of you do too. It's a wonderful thing to have. Go out and eat fresh in your garden.
Yep.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for joining us today, and thank you, Amelia, for preparing such a comprehensive.
Thank you, Priscilla, for helping me with the questions. I appreciate that.
Okay. Bye, all. Thank you.
Bye.